Today, Janice was feeling unusually happy. The reason? She was just a few days away from her long-awaited vacation. It was her last week at work, and thinking about her upcoming break made her really excited. After finishing her work for the day, she headed home, not knowing about the surprise waiting for her. When she got home that evening, Janice was in a great mood. She spotted her husband's suitcase all packed in the hallway, which made her smile even more. She thought he had taken the initiative to pack for their vacation. Seeing her husband wasn't usually good at packing, but this time he had not only packed everything himself, but also remembered to bring a travel pillow, something she found cute and sweet. "Honey, I'm home," Janice happily called out as she entered the kitchen, but her happiness quickly turned to confusion when she saw Sean sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine. He was dressed not in his usual casual clothes, but as if he was about to leave the house. "Sweetheart, what's going on?" "Are you leaving?" Janice asked, sounding confused. "I'm sorry, Janice." "I'm exhausted," Sean began, his voice serious. "I need to leave now. I need time to relax to take care of myself. I think I might be dealing with depression." Janice looked at her husband, feeling bewildered. "But why now? Can't you wait just one more week?" She struggled to understand the sudden change in Sean's mood. "You wouldn't get it, Janice," he replied shortly. "You're always happy at work, with your supportive team around you. Meanwhile, I'm here feeling down and really need a break." Her gaze then fell upon a bank statement lying on the table. To her shock, Sean had moved the money they had saved together into his personal account. Holding the statement, she said with disbelief, "Sean, what about this depression you mentioned? We saved this money for our vacation, our trip to the Bahamas. I've been looking forward to this for so long, and now you're saying we can't go because of your job." Sean responded defensively, his voice tinged with irritation. "I never said my job won't give me time off," he retorted. "Actually, I told them today that this is my last week, and we never decided on a date for our trip. Why plan it now when I can't go with you? You're not thinking straight today, Janice." Feeling hurt and frustrated, she watched him continue packing his things. This wasn't a joke or a passing argument. He was serious about leaving alone without her. "But Sean, this isn't fair," she pleaded. "We saved that money together. If you can't wait for me, at least take your share. I'll take my leave later and join you or go somewhere else with my part." Sean stopped and stared at her, his expression cold and unsympathetic. "What do you want from me, Janice? Do you want me to stay here and fall apart? How do you expect me to split the money? What if I need it all? If there's anything left, I'll bring it back. And Janice, I need one more thing from you," he went on. "Please don't ruin my mood before this trip. I've already mentally checked out. In fact, I've booked my flight for tonight." Janice was stunned into silence by his boldness, especially learning he had already booked a flight for that very evening. She couldn't find the words to respond. Hurt tightened her throat, and she retreated to her room to avoid watching him leave. She had noticed something was wrong lately, his unusual behavior, coming home late, and having unusually long conversations. She just couldn't understand why he had changed so suddenly. Janice had initially pushed aside her troubling thoughts, afraid to confront them head-on. She didn't want to dwell on suspicions that might turn out to be unfounded. Instead, she tried to calm herself and make sense of the situation. Was she overreacting? Maybe it wasn't so unusual for married couples to take separate vacations sometimes. But then, the loud slam of the front door made Janice jump. Did he just leave without saying goodbye? This can't be happening, she thought to herself. She stepped out of her room only to face the harsh reality that it was indeed happening. Just as tears welled up in her eyes, something on the table caught her attention. Sean had left his phone behind. It was locked with a password she didn't know, but an incoming message briefly lit up the screen, giving her enough time to read it. "I'm already at the airport waiting for you, babe. Give me a call when you get there." Before she could fully process the message, the front door creaked open and Sean walked back in. He looked at Janice suspiciously, grabbed his phone, and quickly kissed her on the cheek. "I've got to go, love. Don't worry about anything." Janice was momentarily stunned, but quickly got dressed and hurried out the door, desperately waving for a taxi. The ride to the airport felt like an eternity, filled with anguish and uncertainty. She didn't know where to find Sean, but unfortunately, they were easy to spot. Their behavior was like that of young lovers, reminding her of high school crushes. The woman with Scene looked noticeably younger than Janice. A gasp escaped her lips as she covered her mouth with her hand, watching them from a distance. So this is it. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of believing we were a happy family, she thought bitterly. Janice and Scene's story began in college. Scene was late for an English class and ended up sitting next to Janice, who was known for her beauty. She was so stunning that many guys were too intimidated to approach her, which ironically made Janice doubt herself. When Scene sat next to her, she was intrigued by his confidence. For Scene, it was less about confidence and more about feeling comfortable next to someone he assumed would never notice him. He thought he had no chance with Janice, so there was no pressure or nerves. When a class discussion paired them up, Scene found a reason to start talking to Janice. That's when he discovered she wasn't just beautiful, but also humble and friendly. Perhaps that's when he realized he could win her over. Over time, Scene became more comfortable talking with Janice, ignoring the social gap he initially perceived. One day, he offered to give her a ride home after class. By the end of the semester, they were officially a couple. After they graduated, they took the next big step and got married. But now, their once happy marriage had fallen apart. Scene had used their savings to take his younger mistress to the Bahamas. While Janice would have to go back to work the next day, she would return to an empty home, waiting for her husband to come back from his getaway. She felt utterly alone, with no one to talk to, seek advice from, or even just share her feelings with. Janice grew up without a father, a void that haunted her throughout her life. She never had a father's guidance, love, or protection, leaving her with a deep sense of incompleteness. People often said she would get over it as she got older, but instead, the emptiness seemed to grow over time. Looking back, she realized she tolerated so much of Scene's unacceptable behavior because she had no example of how a man should treat her. This realization pained her deeply, and now it hurt even more as she found herself alone in her sorrow with no one to turn to. When Janice was 18, she lost her mother. She moved in with her aunt, but she always felt like an outsider. Her aunt tried to treat her as one of her own children, but Janice knew it wasn't the same as her mother's love. She stayed with her aunt's family until she could go to college, holding on to the memories of her mother's love and the hope of finding her own path. In the early days of their relationship, living with Scene felt like paradise to Janice. The world seemed brighter, and their home was filled with joy and love. However, as time passed, she began to see another side of Scene that wasn't so pleasing. She realized he was keenly aware of her vulnerabilities and sometimes used them to his advantage. Scene had a part-time job, which Janice accepted at first. She worked full-time herself without begrudging him his seemingly easier schedule. But gradually, she started feeling an unspoken expectation weighing heavily on her shoulders. All the household chores fell solely to her. Every day, she found herself buried in dirty laundry, battling tough stains and ironing wrinkled clothes until her hands were sore. Washing the never-ending stack of dishes left her hands constantly pruned, reminding her of her unacknowledged efforts. Cooking was another story altogether. Every evening, she juggled pots and pans to prepare meals for Scene, who seemed oblivious in his own world. Despite all this, Janice stayed silent, choosing to swallow her frustration instead of speaking up. "Oh well, it's just one of those things," she would often mutter to herself, trying to downplay her growing resentment. Scene, however, remained oblivious to Janice's increasing exhaustion. He enjoyed the luxury of sleeping in late, often not rising until the sun was high and bright. His days were spent locked away in his computer room, immersed in his virtual world, leaving Janice to manage everything else on her own. One evening, while she was busy cooking, Janice called out, "Scene, could you please help me set the table?" "Sure, love," came the distant reply from the computer room, as usual. Janice sighed, dropping the matter as she had done many times before. Yet the unspoken plea for acknowledgement hung in the air, highlighting the growing distance between them. When Scene's father, Robert, fell seriously ill, Scene asked Janice to move in with them to help care for him. Robert was aging and frail, unable to care for himself alone. As Janice had expected, she ended up taking on the responsibilities of both Scene and his father. Despite this, Janice harbored no bitterness toward Robert. Instead, she treated him like her own father, showing him patience and kindness. Robert grew very fond of Janice, noticing more keenly than she realized the imbalance in how his son treated her. One day, Robert cryptically told her, "You, my dear, were never meant to settle." His words puzzled her, leaving her with a question that would linger in her mind. When Robert's health improved, he suggested they move back to their own home, grateful for his recovery but tired from the added caregiving responsibilities. A few months later, tragedy struck Janice's family again. Her aunt passed away from a heart attack. Although Janice felt a pang that she wasn't treated as warmly as her aunt's own daughters, she deeply mourned her loss. This woman had taken care of her after her mother's death, and Janice held a profound love for her deep in her heart. 3 days into mourning her aunt, Scene exploded at Janice. "She's dead, Janice. Stop bringing her up, and for God's sake, stop crying," he yelled. Janice replied, her voice shaking, "It's only been 3 days." She hadn't even cried much outwardly. Her grief was mostly silent, carried inside her heart. Yet, Scene showed little understanding or patience for her subdued sorrow. Now, in the busy airport, Janice snapped out of her thoughts. Part of her wanted to confront Scene or unleash her anger on his mistress, but it was too late. They had disappeared into the crowd. Amid the hustle of travelers rushing to catch flights, Janice stumbled out onto the street, tears blurring her vision. She bumped into people who deftly avoided her until she found herself in a quiet alleyway with a bench covered in snow. She sat down and let her tears flow freely, losing track of time. Eventually, the biting cold woke her from her sobbing. In her emotional haze, a snowstorm had begun. She stood up, brushing snow off herself and rubbing her frost-coated eyes. Her eyelashes were adorned with delicate ice crystals, a sight that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. As she walked towards the alley exit, she noticed a man huddled on the curb, also covered in snow. Her first thought was that he must be out of his mind to sit in such freezing weather. However, consumed by her own turmoil, she couldn't muster the energy to concern herself with him. As Janice walked past the man, she caught a glimpse of his empty, lost eyes, and her heart went out to him. On impulse, she turned back and approached him. She searched her pockets, found some cash, and offered it to him. He looked at her with melancholy eyes but made no move to take the money, continuing to stare blankly ahead. Janice felt unsure of her actions. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you with something?" she asked, hoping for a response. There was no reply. She began to doubt herself. Why am I offering help to someone who won't even acknowledge me? In a final attempt, she suggested, "Maybe I could get you a warm tea or something." A faint smile touched the man's lips, giving Janice a glimmer of hope. Without waiting for confirmation, she hurried into a nearby cafe, bought a hot tea and a sandwich, and returned to him. Despite her own troubles, helping the man brought her a sense of relief and purpose. It felt like she could momentarily set aside her own worries. She handed him the hot tea and sandwich. This time, when he looked at her, his eyes conveyed gratitude. As Janice walked away, the warmth in her heart from helping the man lifted her spirits slightly. She was about to hail a taxi when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw the man standing there. "I'm sorry, miss. I forgot to thank you for your kindness." "Thank you," he said softly. She smiled faintly. It was no trouble at all. "We all have our struggles. I hope things get better for you." "Thank you," he replied, turning to leave. As he walked away, Janice noticed him shivering in the cold. Suddenly, she felt a strong urge to offer more help. "Wait," she called after him. "Why don't you come to my place? You can warm up there, and I can make you a hot meal." The man looked surprised. "Are you sure? I'm just a homeless man." Janice shrugged, unfazed by the taxi driver's reaction. "Have you seen any royalty around here? Everyone's different, that's all," she reasoned calmly. As she hailed a taxi, the driver initially greeted her warmly, but became visibly uneasy when Janice extended her hand to help the homeless man into the vehicle. "I can't believe this. Are you really bringing him with you?" "He's not getting into my car, ma'am." "I'm sorry," the driver said firmly. "Excuse me?" Janice responded, surprised by his refusal. "I'm sorry, but just look at him. He's clearly not clean, and I can't risk damage to my car. I'm going to have to cancel your ride. Who's going to cover the cleaning costs?" the driver insisted. Janice, infuriated by the taxi driver's disrespect, clenched her jaw. She reached into her purse and pulled out a wad of cash. "Will this change your mind?" she asked, handing him the money. The driver took the cash, quickly counting it. A smile spread across his face as he realized the amount. "All right then, come on in," he said, gesturing for the homeless man to get into the taxi. During the ride, the driver became more talkative, chatting about the weather and complaining about low fares. When they arrived at Janice's home, the driver dropped them off and sped away promptly. Inside the warm house, the homeless man let out a sigh of relief. "It's so cozy here," he remarked. "I'll warm up some food. Feel free to relax here or take a hot shower. The bathroom has towels and a robe you can use." "Thank you. I feel like I'm intruding, but I appreciate your kindness. It's been tough, especially without a proper bath," he confessed. Janice found herself questioning her sanity multiple times over. She had invited a complete stranger into her home without even knowing his name, and now he was in her bathroom. No matter how much she pondered her decision, she couldn't come up with a rational explanation. It had been a spur-of-the-moment choice, one that would change her life from that day forward. While putting the final touches on the table, the man emerged from the bathroom, looking fresh and clean. Janice couldn't help but stare in surprise. "You look like a completely different person," she finally remarked. The man chuckled in response. "Fresh shower does wonders," he said. In the meantime, Janice had managed to set the table. The guest, who introduced himself as Dylan and had unexpectedly taken the seat usually occupied by Scene, tasted the warm meal Janice had prepared. He genuinely complimented the flavors, not just making passing remarks, but expressing sincere appreciation for the delicious food. As Janice listened to Dylan express his appreciation for her cooking, a realization dawned on her. It had been so long since she had received any form of recognition. Dylan, still a relative stranger, showed a keen eye for detail as he praised the meal's intricate spices and balanced flavors. His genuine and spontaneous appreciation stirred something deep within Janice, a sense of validation and excitement she hadn't felt in ages. It made her realize how accustomed she had become to her efforts being overlooked and unappreciated. With just a few sincere words, Dylan managed to acknowledge her hard work, and it warmed her heart. Feeling a newfound comfort in Dylan's presence, Janice gathered the courage to ask, "So, what's your story?" As soon as the question left her lips, she noticed a sudden change in Dylan's demeanor. His easy smile faded, and his eyes welled up with tears, yet to be shed. It was evident that recounting his past was deeply painful for Dylan. Just 2 years ago, his life had been the epitome of normalcy, a loving wife, a sweet daughter, and a cozy suburban home filled with happiness. They had planned a joyful family trip to celebrate their daughter's 6th birthday, eagerly anticipating the getaway. But fate intervened. On a rain-soaked mountain pass, their car lost control, skidded dangerously, and plunged over the guardrail. In a horrifying instant, Dylan's world was shattered. His wife and daughter, the center of his universe, were tragically taken from him in the accident. While Dylan miraculously survived physically unscathed, emotionally he was devastated beyond measure. As he shared his story with Janice, the pain in his voice resonated throughout the room. Janice could feel the heart-wrenching sorrow embedded in every word. The weight of losing his loved ones was unbearable for Dylan. He was consumed by guilt, blaming himself for their untimely deaths. Living in the house that had once been filled with the lively sounds of his daughter's laughter and his wife's loving whispers became an agonizing ordeal for Dylan. Every wall echoed with memories, each corner a painful reminder of his profound loss. In an attempt to numb the piercing pain and escape his tormenting thoughts, he turned to the bitter comfort of alcohol. What started as a temporary escape soon morphed into a destructive habit. As Dylan withdrew into self-condemnation, he rebuffed every attempt from friends and family to offer support. Their efforts to lift him from despair hit a wall of refusal. Gradually, life lost its brightness, its essence fading into the shadows of his grief. His growing addiction, coupled with the haunting echoes of his family's laughter in the now empty house, began to affect his work. Despite multiple warnings from his employers, Dylan's decline continued unchecked, leading to his eventual dismissal a few months later. With his finances depleted and debts piling up, Dylan was eventually forced out of the home that had once been the heart of his life. His existence, once filled with love and joy, now spiraled into an endless abyss of despair. Each day became a struggle for survival. At first, he scavenged from trash bins, an experience that left him feeling degraded and hopeless. Yet, as Dylan adapted to life on the streets, he discovered that some restaurants were willing to help the homeless by offering surplus food, especially bread products like bagels and sandwiches. Initially driven by guilt over the tragic loss of his family, Dylan found himself entrenched in a destitute lifestyle. However, as time passed, the harsh realities of homelessness began to weigh heavily on him. What had started as a form of self-punishment now threatened to engulf him entirely, trapping him in a cycle of despair that seemed impossible to break free from. Janice listened to Dylan's story with a deep sense of empathy, her heart heavy with compassion. She assured him that he shouldn't blame himself for the tragic accident that took his family. Her words were sincere, urging him to let go of the guilt that had consumed him and to start rebuilding his life. She painted a picture of a hopeful future ahead, one where he could find peace and purpose beyond the shadows of his grief. Throughout their conversation, Janice maintained a warm and steady gaze, her eyes reflecting understanding and kindness. Her gentle smile remained unwavering, offering Dylan solace and acceptance. For Dylan, who had been devoid of such warmth and kindness for so long, Janice's generosity was overwhelming. This encounter with a stranger who not only provided him with basic comforts, but also offered genuine empathy and guidance, filled him with a newfound sense of hope. The spark ignited in Dylan was unlike anything he had felt in years. Lost in his guilt and sorrow, while living on the streets, he had almost forgotten the possibility of a future beyond mere survival. Meeting Janice, receiving her compassion, and hearing her encouraging words sparked a transformation within him. He began to envision a path forward where he could reclaim his life, standing tall despite the pains of his past, and striving towards a future filled with purpose and possibility. The desire for change had transformed from a fleeting idea into a powerful drive within Dylan. He yearned for the warmth of a home, the stability of a job, and the healing power of meaningful connections. Above all, he sought self-forgiveness and the chance to rebuild his life from the ruins of his past. As they finished their meal, Dylan suddenly realized he was still wearing borrowed clothes. Awkwardly, he glanced down and began to ask Janice about returning them, but she responded with a gentle smile. "It's okay, don't worry about it," she reassured him. Feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort, Dylan started to gather his dirty clothes. Sensing his unease, Janice offered him the use of her washing machine and invited him to stay the night. "I'm sorry for being such a burden. I don't even know how to thank you," he expressed sincerely. "It's all right, Dylan. Don't worry, everything's okay." "Thank you once again," Janice reassured him with a warm smile. Dylan hesitated for a moment before gathering his thoughts and asking his next question. "Janice, may I use your computer, please?" Dylan requested politely, breaking the silence that hung between them. "Of course, feel free," she responded graciously, gesturing towards her laptop. As Dylan began to navigate on her laptop, Janice settled into the living room, her mind swirling with her own stories of sorrow. She felt a deep urge to share her burdens with this stranger who had trusted her with his pain, but the words remained lodged in her throat. Summoning her courage, she stood and made her way over to where Dylan sat. "Dylan," Janice began, her voice trembling slightly, "I hope you don't think less of me for letting a stranger into my home. It's just, my husband, well, I hardly know how to put it. Today he left for a vacation with his mistress." Dylan's fingers paused above the keyboard, and he turned to look at her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Really? That happened?" Janice nodded quietly, offering a brief summary of her situation. Dylan shook his head in disbelief. "I always thought that kind of thing only happened in movies." "I'm really sorry to hear that," he said sincerely. "So, what's your next move?" Dylan gently prompted, encouraging her to continue. "I'm not sure. He might not agree with the idea." Dylan paused, his eyebrows drawing together before he chuckled softly. "Wait, let me understand this. Your husband is out having fun with another woman, and you're worried he might not want a divorce." The situation seemed ridiculous, but it wasn't funny. Looking into Janice's eyes, Dylan saw fear mixed with confusion. She was a kind, innocent woman, beautiful in her simplicity, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. "Are you afraid of him?" he asked gently. "I don't know. We've been together for 5 years, and now I'm not sure what to do." Dylan nodded sympathetically. "Go ahead and get some rest, Janice. We'll figure things out together," Dylan said reassuringly, shaking his head before returning to the computer screen. Tired, Janice decided to lie down on the couch. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of her alarm clock echoing through the room as she walked into the living room. She noticed Dylan was no longer there. On the side table, there was a note he had left behind. "Thank you. Until we meet again." Suddenly, the house felt too quiet. Janice felt a wave of unexpected loneliness wash over her. It was like she had lost something precious. She shuffled into the kitchen to make herself a coffee. The next 2 weeks flew by quickly. Janice threw herself into her work, staying late every night so she could come home exhausted and fall straight into bed. 3 days after Sean left, Janice gathered her courage and began the divorce process. She packed up all of his things, even the robe Dylan had worn, methodically preparing to return them along with the divorce papers. Janice also changed the locks on the house, wanting to ensure her sanctuary remained secure. This house was her inheritance from her parents, the one thing that was undeniably hers, yet she felt a creeping unease that she might have to fight to keep it. Strangely, Janice found herself thinking more about Dylan than Sean. Dylan, who had entered her life as a homeless stranger, but turned out to be someone entirely unexpected. Janice had expected devastation over her husband's betrayal, but instead she felt relief. She was no longer living in ignorance, deceived by a man she thought she knew. Often, everyone else knows about the betrayal before the wife does, which can make her appear foolish to others. With her newfound freedom, Janice's mood brightened. She imagined herself making a salad and watching a romantic movie, enjoying quiet evenings at home. One evening after work, her peaceful routine was interrupted as she approached the house. She saw Sean pacing near the entrance. Remembering she had blocked his number, Janice felt a small burst of joy that he hadn't been able to disrupt her day earlier. "Janice, what the hell is going on? What did you do to the lock? And why did you block my number?" "I've been freezing out here," Sean demanded angrily. Janice faced him calmly, a slight smile on her lips as she replied, "I changed the lock, Sean, and I blocked your number." Sean looked surprised briefly, but then his expression turned to annoyance. "Are you out of your mind? Who do you think you are? Give me the keys now and go take a 3-hour walk while I make a call. Let's see how you like it." Janice calmly searched through her bag, causing Sean to smirk in satisfaction. It dawned on her how accustomed she had become to his bullying and how often she had let it slide in the past. But instead of keys, she'd pulled out a document. "Here, these are divorce papers," Janice said calmly, handing them to Sean. "Whose divorce?" Sean asked, bewildered. "Our Sean. I know you didn't go to the Bahamas alone. I saw you with her. You can collect your things any day, just not today." "Today, I don't want to see you," Janice stated firmly. Sean took a few breaths, then his tone turned surprisingly confident. "Well, guess what? You were supposed to turn a blind eye like a good wife and save our marriage, but you chose the hard way. I'm young, handsome, and interesting. Women are attracted to me." Janice interrupted him, looking towards the driveway where she saw unfamiliar cars pulling in. "Well then, looks like you won't be sleeping on the streets tonight." Sean grabbed her hand tightly. "You're going to do what I say. You thought you could just leave me like that? You're wrong. I'm going to make your life miserable. Give me the keys now." He raised his other hand as if to strike Janice. She closed her eyes, but when she opened them, she realized no one was holding her hand anymore. "Janice, are you okay?" It was Dylan's voice. She couldn't believe it. Dylan stood there, his fist clenched behind him. Sean was struggling in the snow, held back by several strong men standing between Dylan and him. Janice smiled. "It's you." "Yes, it's me. I was worried I wouldn't make it in time." "Any chance you have more of those delicious meals?" Dylan asked, his smile brightening his eyes. Janice nodded, her eyes filling with tears. All the built-up tension and stress had finally found release. She buried her face into Dylan's chest, staining his expensive coat with tears. He gently patted her back, murmuring softly, "Hey, it's okay. Everything's okay now." Sheen, struggling to stand, watched silently as this emotional reunion unfolded. His earlier arrogance had melted into stunned shock. Dylan's arrival not only protected Janice from Sheen's threats, but also marked a turning point in her life. It was the moment she let go of her past and embraced the possibility of a new, happier life ahead. As Sheen watched his world collapse before him, his threats went unheard as he began to realize he was losing Janice. Meanwhile, Janice settled in front of the television, brewing fresh tea while Dylan opened up about a part of his life he hadn't shared before. Her words about moving forward and leaving the past behind had deeply resonated with him, guiding him toward a newfound sense of purpose and resilience. Returning to his former profession, Dylan rejoined the Secret Service, much to the relief of his friends and colleagues. However, Janice missed having him around as a Secret Service agent, realizing the unique and critical role he played. His first priority upon returning was ensuring Janice's safety, setting up a protective detail to watch over her. "You saved me, Janice," he confessed. "I couldn't ignore the kindness you've shown me." Janice looked at him in astonishment. "Secret Service, really?" she repeated, trying to grasp this new information. Dylan nodded, taking a sip of his tea. "Yes, I've been with the Secret Service for years. When I lost my family, I lost myself too. I walked away from everything and fell into a dark place. I couldn't even bring myself to reconnect with my colleagues. But you reminded me that life is worth living, that it's possible to start over even when it feels like the world has ended," Dylan shared, his voice reflecting the depth of his journey. Janice was silent, processing the revelation. A mix of surprise, confusion, gratitude, and something else flickered in her eyes. After a moment, she managed a small smile. "Thank you for everything," she said softly. The peaceful quiet that settled over Janice's home now starkly contrasted with the earlier turmoil. The events had unfolded quickly, leaving Janice still trying to catch her breath. Dylan had left without making promises or revealing his next steps. Yet his gratitude toward Janice was clear as he departed. In an unexpected twist, despite Sheen's actions, Dylan found a silver lining. With a touch of sarcasm, he even thanked Sheen for his affair. If it hadn't been for Sheen's betrayal, Dylan and Janice might never have crossed paths. This unexpected turn added another layer of complexity to the day's events. 2 days passed with Janice settling into a routine of work and quiet evenings at home. The intense emotions from the recent events had started to calm down, leaving her with a sense of peace mixed with curiosity about what lay ahead. One evening, after a long day at work, Janice walked home along her usual route. As she approached her front gate, she saw a figure that made her heart skip a beat. There stood Dylan, bathed in the soft glow of the evening light, his silhouette casting a long shadow on the pavement. He was looking at her with a warm smile, holding a bouquet of flowers whose vibrant colors stood out against the dimming daylight. He looked remarkably different from their last meeting. Dylan was well-groomed and neatly dressed, a stark contrast to the disheveled man she had first encountered. His eyes, once filled with despair, now sparkled with hope and perhaps even happiness. In that moment, Janice recalled the words of her ex-husband's father, "You, my dear, were never meant to settle." Now, she understood the true meaning behind those words.